Hello everyone, I'm Sophie Ramm. I am an architect and painter and I'm assistant and PhD candidate at the research unit of architecture theory and philosophy of techniques of Professor Böhmann at TU Vienna. In this talk I would like to show and reflect upon the didactics of a seminar I gave in the winter semester 24. It was titled Circular Knowledge in Architectonic Imagery, Questioning Architecture's Relation to Knowledge and Imagination. It encompassed 3 cycles. In the first cycle, we worked with surrealist theories which promised to find analogies and metaphors instead of arguments. By interrogating, figuring out, and accumulating, motifs were distilled from paintings. The hypothesis is that images can be crafted according to universal principles that can be attained through mimesis. So painting was treated as figured communication of theories. Within a second cycle, the mechanics from paintings were translated on existing architectural projects, with reference to philosopher Merleau-Ponty and architect Juhani Pallasmaa. Chiasmatic encounters between selected paintings and architectural artifacts were created, with the method of correlating, diffracting, and encountering. In the third cycle, it was about formulating the own architecture according to the distilled motifs. So the method followed Alberti's treatise on painting here with seaming, composing, and illuminating. All these exercises are formulated in gerundium because it is about the action, the mechanics involved in images. Marco Foscari considers drawings as the means by which architects order, catalogue, and express their cosmopoetic intent. This cosmopoesis is to be understood as a world-making in the sense of a remaking. The structure of thinking itself would stem from the embodiment within architecture. So he calls for an understanding of the mechanisms that drive representation. He suggests to recognize the processes of conversion and transformation taking place within the highly undisciplined discipline of architectural imagination. The exercises also do not function isolated. It is more about the processes of conversion and transformation taking place. To Jörg Kleiter, it is impossible to discuss architecture today without addressing its theoretical status as an image in its own communicative structure. Kleiter's main argument is that we now need to reconceptualize architecture as an epistemological metaphor. This means seeing architecture not just as a physical space, but as a way of knowing and understanding the world. Kleiter points out the suspicion towards images goes back to the beginnings of modernity. In the pre-modern era, architecture was seen as a medium for representing cosmological and philosophical orders. Then, during modernity, the role of architecture shifted from representation to spatial creation. This shift brought architecture into direct competition with mass media, leading to the current tension between material space and virtual representation. In his work, Theories and History of Architecture from 1981, Manfredo Tafuri critiques modern architectural culture for being too inward-looking and self-contained. He argues that architecture should engage more with how people interact with buildings and spaces rather than focusing solely on the intellectualized formal processes. The architect should act as interlocutor. He should engage with highly intellectualized figurative processes. So Tafuri connects the articulation of forms, how architectural elements are composed and expressed, to a kind of baroquism, a complexity and theatricality in architectural expression. Critical architecture should be self-reflective. Juhani Pallasmaa argues that architecture today is threatened by 2 opposite processes. So on the one hand, we have instrumentalization. A materialist culture is turning buildings into mere instrumental structures devoid of mental meaning for the purposes of utility and economy. On the other hand, we have aestheticization. Architecture increasingly turns into seductive images without roots in existential experience. Pallasmaa calls them retinal images. only focused on visions and not on the experience of space. They seem to promote a flat reality. What is lost is the mental extension and projection, the evocation of imagination and memory. The architectural image is an interpretation and concretization of an idealized order. An artistic image derives from a mental soil of shared myths, memories, images, and experiences. Pallasmaa observes a paradox where modern culture, despite being dominated by vision, is constrained by a logocentric bias that diminishes the value of visual and embodied knowledge. He suggests that mass-produced passive images may undermine authentic imagination. Pallasmaa argues that the shift from knowledge to mere information weakens imagination along with empathy and ethics. So he highlights the emancipatory role of imagery and calls for its rehumanization through poetic embodied imagination defined by curiosity and selflessness. Therefore, he calls for a revival of the poetic and embodied image in architecture. Image acts. Images as man-made artifacts have no autonomous life, yet they unfold and effect that makes them more than that matter but autonomously active entities. In the encounter between viewer and image, the recipient does not receive his own subjective perception of the image alone, but is confronted with a counterpart that possesses and exercises autonomy in its distinct form. It is about the question of the energia emanating from the artworks. The imaginary vitality of the images covers a wide spectrum. In mythology, it found expression in the story of Pygmalion and Galatea. In this seminar, we took as reference the treatise on painting of Leon Battista Alberti, which introduced a radical shift in the artist's self-perception by grounding painting in science. His works, De Pictura and Elementa Pictore, place geometry and optics at the core of painting. For Alberti, architecture is painting in space. He applies the principles of composition not only narratively but also architecturally, grounding it in the physics of vision. A key component in Alberti's theory is the velo, a woven grid that represents the visual plane through which objects are projected in perspective. This concept, borrowed from Brunelleschi's experiments, was instrumental in translating the perspective apparatus into a method of visual rays. The surface of an object, when divided into points, becomes a structured composition, and Alberti does not focus on the artist but the knowledge in art. So the first exercise in this seminar was named circumscribing. The term image, as we have seen, cannot be ultimately defined. It extends beyond a two-dimensional frame involving the body, perception, and optics. One approach to better understand this concept is by the act of circumscribing, which means to make a circle around or to mark out bounds. In this first exercise, a glossary of terms was created that relate to the act of image making and imagination. So students picked citations from Alberti, Wesley, Foscari, and Pallasmaa, and they, on the one hand, chose familiar terms we use in a certain vagueness like balance, proportion, or illusion, but they also used more technical terms like stratigraphy, sciografia, or lineamenti from Alberti's treatise on painting. Luminosity is circumscribed as a quality of emitting light, a figurative brightness emphasizing the interplay of light and perception. Some words are connected to the construction of an image mentioned by Alberti, like the centric ray that is called the prince of rays that strikes an object at a central point, creating equal angles on either side. Awareness in the optics of the embodied image is not connected to a moral posture but more connected with a consciousness. Here it is about the different awarenesses that create a certain tension within a work of art. So we came to the first cycle, Surrealist theories. The Surrealists criticized the decline of the imagination in a society for which art and poetry had become eccentric activities. Here we see the cover of the Minotaur magazine with contributions from artists, writers, philosophers, and psychoanalysts, and it was meant to be read as a collective work. Daedalus, Ariadne, the Labyrinth were the icons of the Surrealists. Dali writes, the great thoughts in art and science in the same period often follow parallel ways without their authors being aware of it. In the beginning of the 20th century, Surrealist theory correlated not only with a revolution in psychoanalysis, but also with scientific revolutions in physics, like the institutionalization of Einstein's theory of relativity and the emergence of quantum physics. Key figure for Surrealist artists was Gaston Bachelard. He stressed out the role of imagination. The book on the new scientific spirit was inspiration for Surrealist artists. It's a reflection on concepts of time, space, memory. Painters do not write as philosophers, but as artists who want to raise philosophical questions. Like Wolfgang Pahlin, born in Vienna, and here we see his book Form and Sense. Pahlin's Dianetic concept implies that reality is not static or final, but consists of possibilities that can be discovered and realized through art and science. Art is seen as a means of exploring and interpreting reality alongside science. Imagination is both inspired by reality and autonomous and has an effect on reality. But what about the relation of Surrealism with architecture? Dalibor Wisli, who was influential through his teaching and writing in architecture, claimed that the task of poetry in Surrealism was not to substitute the existing reality, but to transform it through the alchemy of words and images. He was the main editor of the Architectural Design edition on Surrealism and architecture. He later had to admit that architecture never became an integral part of Surrealist thoughts in the same way as painting, sculpture, and the creation of Surrealist objects. It was more treated as an objet trouvé. Thomas Mikal, professor of architectural history and theory, examines in this book a long overlooked topic, the relationship of Surrealist thought to architecture theory and practice. He claims that within modern architecture there would lie a secret history of Surrealist thought. What characterizes those Surrealist paintings? Chirico's art is dreamlike, but it is never too close to dream, Wesley writes. Its mystery is construction, metaphysical geometry, which at certain point collapses into ambiguity. Based on a systematic study of Renaissance perspective, the world of Chirico's paintings or drawings are disturbing in their precise awareness of the space that divides different objects and establishes a new astronomy of objects attached to the planet by the fatal law of gravity. He cites Chirico. Surrealist or metaphysical paintings require time to unfold. They defy precise explanation, so we access them through interrogation. Amelia Campbell worked with the painting Imaginary Numbers. She draws an analogy with the uncanniness of the deep ocean, with its vastness and possibilities left to uncover while being intermingled with the world we know so far. Imagining the possibility of negative square roots is for her like delving into reality of the painting, discerning familiar shapes like cliffs, bridges and valleys. Tobias Leichner on the right takes the painting of Roberto Matta as departure to think about the landscape and mechanics of dreaming. He discerns apparatuses connected by invisible forces of attraction, holding each other in a balance approaching collapse, he writes. A vague, dark storm rages behind the golden hills. The fragile balance of the apparatuses fills the shimmering, soft gauge of the golden fields, he writes. So he turns the painting into a gravitational field in which the figures orbit. Both the students write spatially and in circles instead of building up arguments. They treat the paintings as visual embodiments and examples of theories without interpreting them. The next exercise was called Figuring Out. To view the ground only as a background surface would deny its potency for the act of the image. So how to think of an activity of the ground or campo. Borioni suggests that by choosing the word ground, painting itself was understood as a regular architectural process, a work built from the foundation, so to speak. The continuum is an indispensable accompanying and background phenomenon that makes acts of structuring even possible, so it gives them a place. Leinkauf points to the simultaneity of natura naturans and natura naturata within each point of the picture. This reminds us of the relation of inventio and inventum in Alberti. Böhm writes of the ground of the Giericus painting as acting as a metamorphic reservoir from which figurations of the uncanny emerge. The ground is the thing that gives, which is itself not defined, not given. Instead of conceiving it as a plane, we conceive it here as a deep fundus. The ground creates a space for discourse and is at the same time part of this event, creating counterforces. The counterforce or counterpart is the figure. Auerbach proposes that the term figure expresses something living and dynamic, incomplete and playful. The figurative fluctuates between suggestive, revealing, or concealing. The figurative fluctuates between suggesting, revealing, or concealing. Figuration is then associated with a clear shift in emphasis from the product to the process. It is about the inclusion of temporality. So in the exercise Figuring Out, I asked the students to treat the ground as a metamorphic reservoir, a space of discourse that actively interacts with the figures in your painting. What is continuous and what is discernible? What defines the relationship? How might the painting operate over time? Giulia Oliveri worked with inaugural Gooseflesh of Dali. She developed a play between the hollow body and the cellular entities. The scene opens with the words, "The ground is in a subtle vibration, as if it still echoes past movement, charged with tension. A thin layer of human skin lies abundant on the ground at the center of the scene, something like an empty shell," she writes. The hollow body questions if the cellular entities are abandoning it or if they were a reflection of what it has become. The gooseflesh dance is imagined like the tiny electric sparks in waves of expansion and contraction. The cellular entities answer that they would be a rising memory of the hollow body, which then dissolve into the horizon. So this play figures out the relation of fragility, memory, body, and skin, exfoliations of inner sensations. The student Ariana Nocent worked with the painting Song Cecilia of Max Ernst. To capture the weight of air, she writes, she figured out the characters of Daphne and Echo the bird. The thickness of air is holding everything in place, it says. So the myth of Daphne, who fled from Apollon and was transformed by her father to a laurel tree, gives a new layer to the painting. Of the bird, she writes, a bird named Echo floats near Daphne, its wings twisted, as if it has forgotten how to fly. A conflict between stillness and movement unfolds in a dialogue with the bird who watches Daphne. They remain caught together in a timeless place. The next exercise is accumulating. The painting should be now treated as amphora of motifs. Reference for this was the artist Madelon Friesendorp. Her declared aim is to put together a wide range of incongruous and diverse items from different cultures which, through sheer accumulation, change their status. At its best, she writes, the archive is a microculture clash, a visual surprise, the least plausible depiction of an idea. It includes examples of accidental or calculated imperfection, objects of muddled origins, sometimes heavy with symbolic pretext, and rejects from an outdated or never fashionable artistic order, reinterpreted, misrepresented, bizarre, or missed. Her collection serves as a constant inspiration, so she rearranges families of objects or makes collages that seem to her as if they would compose themselves on their own. She does not present a straightforward narrative, but rather enigmatic juxtapositions, like still lifes in which the objects take on a life on their own, resisting a grand narrative. In this case, it is not Friesendorf telling an alternative story. Instead, the things here, buildings, are no longer just objects, but rather invite one into their world. Artifacts tell the stories. As next step, one metaphor should be figured out that correlates to the questions developed through the confrontation with the painting. We worked with the lectures of Borges on painting, where he asserts from universal patterns metaphors, always linking two distinct things together, such as eyes and stars. He names examples of formulations of the same metaphors in different contexts, which change their meaning. Other references should be found in the poems of John Haydock, Paul Klee, Octavio Paz, and Rainer Maria Rilke. Like Friesendorf, it was about rearranging without clustering, without drawing conclusions, but juxtaposing a metaphor in different contexts. Tong Hoining was inspired by Dali's still life moving fast, hyper-artificial scenery, and yet like a still from reality. So she gathers different gestures of putting something on a stage to the virtual. She has some findings in the poems of Haydock and Rilke and other surrealist paintings. Rilke is, for example, writing of marionettes as an exterior entrusted with conviction. Nefeli Rehberger worked with Dali's painting of the Galatea of the spheres, deriving from the myth of Galatea, questioning her consciousness, her fragmentation, creation and decay. She adds some citations on foam in Spoobrok, the memory of Orpheus through the lens of Haydock. So she came to the metaphor of the fleeting memories, which should later turn into the so-called disintegrating knot. Then we came to the second cycle, embodied imagination. Within the second cycle, the mechanics from paintings were translated on iconic architectural projects. Architecture was taken as locus to reflect on previous questions. Perez Gomez highlights the link between metaphor and embodied consciousness. Metaphor would allow to speak on a vernacular level and at the same time out of time and place, revealing something else, he writes. Phenomenology has argued that things speak to us, that perception is by definition meaningful, the world would be expressive. Paraphrasing Merleau-Ponty, precisely because it comes to dwell in the world in which it makes us at home, though we do not hold the key to it, the work of art and architecture teaches us to see and makes us think as no analytic work can. It cannot be reduced to a single theme, but different layers exist side by side. This is why architecture is connected with memorizing. In the book Understanding Architecture of Pallasmaa and McCarter, 2012, it is written, actual buildings as well as remembered images and metaphors of architecture serve even today as memory devices in three different ways. First, they materialize and preserve the course of time and make it visible. Second, they concretize remembrance by containing and protecting memories. Third, they stimulate and inspire us to reminisce and imagine. One who cannot remember also cannot imagine, as memory is the very soil of imagination. Thus, architecture creates, frames and horizons not only the experiences but also the memory. This correlates with Merleau-Ponty's concept, we come to see not the work of art but the world according to the work. So architecture turns into a lens, buildings, structure, reorient and attune our mental thinking. To Pallasmaa, it is the task of architecture to create embodied and lived existential metaphors that concretize and structure our being in the world. With reference to philosopher Merleau-Ponty and architect Juhani Pallasmaa, chiasmatic encounters between selected paintings and architectural artifacts were created. The metaphors served as bridging ideas. In which relations could the painting and architecture enter with each other? It is a speculative method, a logos not of language but of relations. architecture is understood as an objet trouvé, as quotation of painting. So students chose from a selection of canonical paintings from the 1920s to the 1950s. Gaia Cataneo turns the Farnsworth house into a place of rebellion. She had gathered references around dance, rhythm, and the cycle of time, through which she came to the metaphor place of rebellion. She writes of the body becoming part of the building, the place absorbing it. The organized nature of this place is questioned. She mentions the regular checkerboard floor that draws relation to her painting. The voice takes us with it when she writes, moving counterclockwise around the space, circling the central core. It is described as a dance around the so-called mechanical center of the entire building, which is linked to her painting, The Alchemist, of Remedios Varo. In the end, the body dissolves into the space and at the same time reclaims it. The next exercise was called diffracting. There's a strong relation between the surreal paintings and the ideas of quantum physics. In the realm of architecture of this time, it is not so obvious that the ideas were incorporated. So in this exercise, the students superimposed them with the ideas of quantum physics. According to classical physics, diffraction is a physical phenomenon that comes into being when a multitude of waves encounter an obstacle upon their path, and/or when these waves themselves overlap. Rather than employing a hierarchical methodology that would put different texts, theories, and strands of thought against one another, here they are dialogically read through one another to engender unexpected outcomes. The stones for creating the interference pattern were the new scientific spirit, which I already mentioned, where Bachelard writes, there are no simple phenomena, every phenomenon is a fabric of relations. There is no such thing as a simple nature, a simple substance. A substance is a web of attributes. No idea can be understood until it has been incorporated into a complex system of thoughts and experiences. Another reference was Eliot Weinberg's selected non-fictions of Jorge Luis Borges and Karen Barat's book Meeting the Universe Halfway of 2007. All those question and the understanding of space, time, matter, causality, and agency. The student Davide Battel worked with the text of Borges called A New Refutation of Time, in which questions on matter, self, and time are negotiated through the optics of Berkeley and Hume. He diffracted those ideas with his painting Oedipus Rex, from which he selected the figure of the seeker and watcher, and he diffracted it with Maison de Verre. He concretized his own metaphor through this, a muff near a candle. Then he selected one wave pattern. It is written in an impersonal way, full of embodied perception. He writes, the original light beam is a seeker in its nature and perceives everything as steady and upfront, in a fixed time and dimension on a line. It is a known state, a known past, as the urban fabric of early 20th century Paris. A small passageway leads into the inner courtyard where the building is located. An interesting situation appears here as the angle of the passageway is orthogonal, but there's a rotation inside the first courtyard between the facade of the street block and the facade of the house. Through the second double slit of diffraction happens a loss of the sense of self. One existed as a momentary term in the bundle or collection of different perceptions. And then he writes, it is maybe in the waking act that one becomes pierced, inevitably. The pattern becomes readable, and one can realize how the succession of moments of perception was ultimately all contained in one circular unit, as the subject itself, the beam seeking, the body constrained, the head watching, the object pierced, and so on. So the student worked with diffraction on an architectonic level, with rhythmic sentences weaving together the references. So did Liliane Herbert. She worked with the metaphor of the face around the question of the self, inspired then by Karen Barat. The locus is the house of Eileen Gray. She writes, "Here we are now, standing in front of a glass facade and looking over the sea. We are isolated from our own reflection in the glass. The sea enters the space and the floor is flooded by its gentle breath. With every rhythm that echoes the waves, the floor hums and walls exhale." After meeting the ocean, she continues, "Tomorrow the sea will still be there. The house will have a different face. The ritual will begin anew." So the essay resembles the tides of the ocean. The changing of faces is put in analogy with the movement of the tides, which pulsates through the walls. The ideas are encapsulated, so the dissolvement of the subject and object, the references are smoothly interwoven. The world is perceived as an entanglement of social and natural agencies. Then we worked with the idea of treating architecture's counterpart as embodied philosophy. Louis Kahn speaks to bricks as if they were animate. He does not simply attribute life to them, it is more about the architect's attitude towards matter. We discussed the lecture of Louis Kahn on silence and light. He chooses his words very precisely, waving their meaning, joining them. He gives new meaning to ordinary words through putting them in new constellations, with refrains containing only minor variations. He claims that only within architectural settings we are able to say something significant, so we would need architecture to set a framework. So I asked students to either craft a resonance poem or a resonance drawing. As Foscari says, in architecture there cannot be a precise divide between drawing and writing, between the craft and skills of drawing and that of a scribe. Architects are both scribes and drawing persons. So Nefelia Rehberger drew a resonance painting of a metaphor disintegrating knot, meeting the Casa Malabhate. So it is a crystallization of thoughts from the essay and the wave pattern. Guze-Ramskova crafted a resonance poem of her metaphor growing tree with the Villa Marea. She writes, "Timber stretched taut, a quiet hum of pine, brushed by sun, shadow whispers on floorboards. A door opens to a forest and a room, branches grow into ceilings, ceilings dissolve into sky," and so on. It is investigative without rhyme, very concrete, and the abstract lies in between. Architecture and poetry also share the qualities of precision, matrix, structure and rhythm as essential constituents in both their creative process and manifestation. It is a play of contrasting opposites, the solid and void in architecture, sound and silence in poetry. Then we came to the cycle 3, the architectonic articulation. We divide the art of painting into 3 areas, Alberti writes, and this division has been conveyed to us by nature itself. For since painting endeavors to present things seen, let us note the way in which the things themselves come into our view. So first, when we behold something, we first see that it is something that occupies a place. The painter, however, will circumscribe the extent of this place, and he will call this procedure drawing a scene, with the appropriate word circumscription. Second, on closer inspection we can then recognize how several surfaces of a body in view abut one another, and the artist will mark these connections of surfaces in their respective places and call them appropriately composition. Third, finally, if we look even more closely, we can distinguish the colors of the surfaces. The representation of this fact in painting, because its peculiarities depend on how the light falls, may quite appropriately bear the name incidence of light, which I then called illuminating. So, in the first exercise, seaming, it was now a group work, meant to seam individual perspectives onto a common hem. The students chose their vocabulary in reference to Kahn and put it in constellations and commented on each other's terms. It evolved through a continuous interrogating and commenting upon individual circumscriptions of terms. So it is more about the relations they enter with each other than their singular meaning. Composing. Artifacts are able to externalize thoughts and make them common, so they communicate. The main reference for the cycle was John Hado's Mask series. in which he realized the idea of the city as a theatre of characters composed of architecture. Creating a mask meant for Hayduk, finding the significant characters of one's epoch and granting them representation through architecture. He establishes a number of fixed characters in relation to the plot of the work, just as in ancient theatres. The house is never just a generic house, but the house of a particular inhabitant, and it has to represent his or her role in the city. So there's no preset and generalized principle. But the order is formulated in relationships these single or grouped elements establish with each other. Each subject-object pair is accompanied by a small scenario, a canovaccio, that describes the activity that takes place. Hayduk creates figurative archetypes of architecture. References for those archetypes are industrial structures like water towers or tanks. Those are forms everyone recognizes. They are of collective memory. He builds up a vocabulary of elementary minimalistic forms that have iconic character. Typological inventions are developed through the recombination of those elements. They are reconnected in a new logic, forming an organism. So in this seminar we took this work as a toolset. The task of architecture is then to turn thoughts into things. The character should be inspired by the exercise figuring out. David Gersten writes, this principle reveals the artistic instinct of man, who must clothe the incomprehensible world full of mysteries and wonders in an appearance that is comprehensible to his ideas and needs. The iconic acts as a complement of the logical and as a mask for the experimental. So, Liliane and Davide, they worked with the Tower of Hollow Light, which is only possible through many translations and absorbing and exercising many references. They called it the City of the Old Light, Palais Loifus, a former lighthouse that attracted many visitors. It forgets her own light and turns into a reflecting semisphere that mirrors back all light that arrives, holding it until its resonance vanish, accompanied by the pulsation of the ocean with waves that rhythmically crash against the rocks. The elements are in a relation of conundrum, whereas light and motion are not bound by predictable patterns. The names of the structure, like the endless corridor of the unaware beam, incorporate the surrealist paintings they had worked with. Arianna and Nefeli worked with the fountain of still air and the house of still air's capturer. It is about symbiosis and movement. They write a solid stone structure with smooth, seamless walls interrupted only by cracks that run through the surface and allow light, air and sound to penetrate. The still air capturer's house stands proud and immovable, its form a symbol of stability and unity. Its wide, stable base is made of heavy stone, anchoring it firmly in place. The house seems to grow out of the ground, its presence unshakable. This last exercise refers to the last part of the construction of a painting that Alberti called Luminum Receptio. It meant to reflect on the concept at the scale of a city. The gesture and tonality is inspired by Calvino's book Invisible Cities. So in all exercises, there's a continuous upwards and downwards movement. The architectonic act, the multiplicity of reality, which is always immanent in the figurations. Thanks for listening.